All right, I'm going to start off with a show of hands question. And if you feel like you need to stretch, you can stand up. I know some of you in this room are going to need to stand up because of the question. So who in this audience has participated in some shape or form in one of the many workforce system recommendation reports that have been released over the past dozen or so years? We can go back to 2013 with the Re-envisioning New York City Workforce System Report. So this could be you've sat for an interview or a focus group, you have been on a task force or an advisory committee or a steering committee, or you've authored in some way, shape, or form one of these reports. I was going to say, some of you stand up, because you've been part of many of these. Yeah. So when we first came together last week to prepare for this session, our collective inclination was kind of like, let's just really, tear off the gauze. Let's make sure when we talk through our topic that we're not just sharing the success stories, that we're also looking at what are some of the conditions that can make or break some of these models. So as Greg was saying, what are the elephants in the room that we need to make a seat for? And so that's what we hope to do today. I wanted to pose that question in opening up this session, just to serve as a reminder that we as a community are really good at coming together to ideate around what should happen to build or to strengthen the workforce development ecosystem. But why is it that many of the ideas that are proposed in these reports, over the years, they're not adopted, they're adopted, maybe partially, and then they show up in a new iteration in the next set of reports. So we kind of recycle these ideas over and over again, and is it that we need to take a look at what are the conditions for these things to work, as well as what is going to make it kind of stop it in its tracks. So pay for success models are only recently beginning to creep into these types of reports, maybe looking at the last couple of years, and it's usually in the context of how can we expand the pie of funding. So funding usually shows up in some way, shape, or form. So when we say pay for success, which we will get into, I'm going to assume that most of you have at least a base knowledge, but we'll make sure that we're on equal ground. So New York City and New York State, they're not entirely new to the use of these types of models. If you go back, for example, to the later years of the Bloomberg administration, social impact bonds were used around an initiative that was focused on addressing adolescent incarceration. And more recently, NYSERDA, or the New York State Energy, let me see if I can get it right, Energy and Research and Development Authority, so used to saying NYSERDA, they've been making use of pay for success models to fund a series of clean energy training programs, and Empire State Development has also been using this model. So, but the use of it is still limited. What we wanted to do today with Kirsten, Ashley, and Tara is talk about the use of pay for success nationally, in Philadelphia, in New Jersey. I think we have some good examples to kind of ground us, and then start to pick apart, so what are those conditions that we need to make sure are in place? For example, where does pay for success not work well? Where is it that we're going to set ourselves up for failure if we try to use it with a certain population or type of training? Or what are the expectations that need to be clearly set with some of our stakeholders, like employers, government, and philanthropy, in order for this to work, or in order for it to go past a pilot phase? So to get us started off, Kirsten, I wanted to have you just walk through, in brief, what a pay for success framework looks like. And then if you can speak more specifically about why this is a model that is thought to be promising, or has been promising, in workforce development in particular.
Absolutely. Well, it's terrific to be here with all of you. Kirsten Hill, President and CEO of Social Finance. We're a nonprofit with offices including here in New York City, really founded 15 years ago, really around the idea of pay for success. But if we even broaden the idea of pay for success as we talk about it here, to think about outcomes-based financing, or in this context, workforce-based financing, what are we talking about? The core building blocks, I would say, are, do we have an understanding of what the financial gaps and barriers are in our context for people to participate and persist in good workforce training programs that get them good paying jobs? Do we have access to capital that can kind of fill that gap? And then at the end of it, is there some ability for financial recyclability, for incremental payment based on outcomes, right? In this context, good jobs, good wages. That might be a payment from a government to say, yes, the outcome was achieved, maybe not even just being employed, but being employed for a period of time at a certain wage to incent that outcome. It might be a repayment from the student or the learner themselves, if and only if they get that outcome, if they get that high-paying career. Or in some cases, and I know we're going to talk about this later, perhaps even from employers to say, okay, I have hired this person, you have met my workforce need, my labor market need, and now let me pay back into the system for that success that you've helped me achieve. And so hopefully in that example, I've laid out a little bit how it can work in the workforce context, but maybe just to animate it one click further, and I know we partner with both Ashley and Tara on this, which is if you start with, you've got a learner who's existing on the financial margins, looking for access to opportunity. You've got a labor market that's looking to hire people, but they're experiencing barriers. There's a reason they're not participating in the program that gets them that job. It might be a tuition barrier. It might be a life barrier, meaning it is hard to be able to afford to not work and go to school. And that is a real barrier for people existing on the financial margins. So do we have the capital that can fill that need? And then can we measure at the end of that whether people are succeeding if they're getting that job that's paying above, for example, $60,000 a year? And in that context, ask for some element of paying it forward. So some repayment that then goes back to serve the next learner, and the next learner to make that system more sustainable in its form.
Thank you. We're going to, I think that helped just to lay the groundwork for what this is. We're going to dig in on a couple of models that have been in effect in, as I mentioned, Philadelphia and in New Jersey. Tara, why don't we start with you, if you can talk about how the state of New Jersey has been experimenting with and implementing Pay for Success.
Sure. So hi, everyone. Really thrilled to be back with NYCETC. I was on the board for many years, and it's like a homecoming in many regards. The Pay for Success model we've launched and rolled out in New Jersey is called the New Jersey Pay It Forward program. And I think one of the themes that we've taken away from it, building on what Stacey was saying, is that when you're designing these models, you have to decide what your priority is, because if you say everything's your priority, then nothing's your priority. And we built a model at the beginning that was supposed to be a miracle and was not going to, it was going to collapse under its own weight. It was essentially envisioned as something that would provide loans for students who needed them for these kinds of gaps that Kirsten is talking about. It was going to be the most student-friendly model that had ever existed. All the employers that contributed to it were going to hire the students and pay the money back. It was going to have the strongest student protections in the world, and it was going to live for 100 years. And those things are at fundamental odds with each other. And so I think what we did as the state of New Jersey, working across about a half dozen state agencies, was we had to wrestle with some tough conversations about what do we care about most? And ultimately, where we landed was a model that focused on being that last dollar money for students for whom high quality training was either unaffordable or they would have had to take out private loans or incur debt or use their own limited savings to cover that cost. We had to be very targeted about what trainings and occupations are a good match for this. And so I think when we talk about, the elephant in the room or some of the issues that we confront, there is a financial calculus that comes into play when you're designing these models. And too often, and this is me going back to my roots in adult education and adult literacy here in New York, too often we're focused on the financial models that work for people who are at the higher reading and math levels, which are hugely important. The finances are likely not going to work for people at the lower levels yet. And so too often, I think they get kind of pushed out of the picture yet again. So what we built in New Jersey was a model ultimately really focused in healthcare. And we provide loans to students to use after they have exhausted other funds, which could be Pell or potentially workforce Pell, however that plays out, the state's tuition assistance and ITA vouchers, but they borrow the delta between that and then they pay it back. Again, as Kirsten said, that they pay it forward, really. There's no return to investors. It's a zero interest, zero fee loan. And crucially, and this is certainly building on the time, my time as a provider here in New York, it was really crucial that we provide them with the ability to live and support their family while they're in training. And I know there's a panel later today from my old stomping grounds at Center for an Urban Future about the importance of supports and supporting people while in training. And so we provide non-repayable grants where people get living stipends, $500 a month for the duration of while they're in full-time training. That's something they do not pay back. And then we also have an emergency aid fund for the things that can derail people's participation. So all told, the state of New Jersey has put in over $20 million to this effort. The corporate sector has put in about $5 million, and we expect to get an additional $4 million back in repayments from students. And we'll have enrolled and certified loans for over 1,000 New Jerseyans over the next several years. So really excited about the promise we've seen, but there's still a lot of areas where this program doesn't work, and I think we need to be honest about that as well.
Thank you, Tara. And I appreciate you jumping right in and pointing to, I think, some of those elements that I will confess, myself, have given me pause when you think especially about the potential burden on the individuals going through training. Ashley, I want to give you a chance to talk about some of the Pay for Success work in Philadelphia. And I mentioned in my introduction just making sure that the conditions are clearly set and established for different stakeholders, including employers, and that's been a part of some of the work. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And like Tara, I'm really excited to be back in New York City. New York City was home for 15 years, and I really cut my workforce teeth in some ways here with quite a few of
Didn't
folks
we
here.
all?
Yeah, didn't we all? Didn't we all? And it's exciting, I think, some of the things that I was interested in my time when I was at City Hall in New York that I've gotten to really explore while I've been at the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is really interested in these things because we are looking at how do we create a labor market where everyone has access to the employment that they're seeking. Now, being that I'm at the Federal Reserve, I also have to start today with a disclaimer, which is that my views today are mine alone and do not represent the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Open Market Committee. So there we go. I got to do that every time I speak. That being said, I think what's been talked about on this stage already is really interesting because for us at the Fed, what interested us was also how are we thinking about financing outcomes and not outputs? And this is really how we came to start collaborating with social finance. So there was a book that came out that was a Federal Reserve System book looking at outcomes and thinking about the difference. And I'll give you how I think about this in the workforce way. An output would be something we can achieve short term. So pardon this, but I always call this the butts and seats payment method, right? So I'm paying you to put a certain N number of people in a classroom, and you get paid if N number of people enroll in the class. You're not getting paid if they finish the class. You're not getting paid necessarily if they get a job. And really for us, the outcome we were really interested in is not just that you get a job, but that you're getting a job that provides you upward mobility, right? That is the goal. That's what we're talking about today is financing mobility. So are we getting you a job that you stay in? And I think that's been something we've been really interested in is, well, what does it look like to realign systems and realign funding and capital? So when we started having the prep for this panel, I think the takeaway I had was we all have talked for many years and many reports about broken, siloed, non-functioning workforce development systems. It's not just a conversation in New York City, it's a conversation in Philly, it's a conversation in Charlotte, North Carolina, it's a conversation all over the country. And I've been privileged to be in spaces to talk about a bunch of different city leaders looking at this. But I think fundamentally, if you want to realign systems, you have to think about how you pay for things differently. So if we keep paying for the same thing, well, people follow the money, right? Your workforce providers follow the money, the employers follow the money. And if we aren't realigning how that capital flows, you're not creating more equitable or inclusive systems. And so this gets us to the problem we sought to solve in Philadelphia, which was, where are the employers in this financing? So we give you a traditional kind of economic theory here. You've got your workforce development board, they're contracting to, a workforce development provider or nonprofit. That nonprofit is being told, you need to produce people at this skill level. They need to be able to, code in XYZ language or work with this kind of customer. They need to act this certain way, talk this certain way, and the employer will then maybe hire them, right? And I say this a lot to say a lot of employers we've worked with, they're engaged in industry partnerships, they sit on workforce development boards, but they are not financial investors in the workforce development system. Now on the Fed, we also had a book at the time around workforce where we looked at where employers were paying for workforce, and we see employers really gear their upskilling programs towards the higher end, right? They're upskilling executives, they're upskilling managers. They're not thinking about how they're upskilling an entry-level worker necessarily. Now, it may be shifting, but that was one of the fundamental problems we sought to solve. How do we make employers investors? When we get to outcomes, the outcome is important to the employer too, right? They are on these panels and participating in these boards because they also want a really good candidate. And I think one of the things we learned from this model was it's important for us to be aligning the investments so that we align the outcomes. So we worked with social finance to sort of explore, well, what would it look like to have a pay-for-success model where the employer pays back the cost of training? And I will say Tara had an initial model that we talked about with Seedco that was a pilot where we were actually measuring the dollars with social finance, and they estimated that helping someone retain a job was saving each employer $3,000 a person, right? So the biggest risk we found for employers is the cost of turnover. And so the question is, well, if that's really saving you money, are you willing to invest in it? And so we sought out to understand where are employers actually paying for workforce programming, and how do we create a model where that risk is shared between the workforce provider, the workforce development board, and the student, and the employer as well. So the Pay for Success model we initially piloted in, I believe it was the year 2021. So it was in the pandemic. We had lots of struggles and issues that came up as a result of the pandemic. But it was one single employer paying back the workforce board in that instance to provide outcomes. And they measured outcomes as hiring and 6 months retention. This got picked up most recently by a workforce provider that's a place-based neighborhood provider in Philly called the West Philadelphia Skills Initiative. They're a great organization. I recommend you look up their work. But they actually have employers in life sciences and healthcare where they're providing really high-end training and saying to those employers, look, this is just like a talent agency, right? You're gonna pay us back when the talent we get you stays there for 1 year. And they've had huge success with that, and it has also created a new revenue stream for the workforce provider that is flexible funding that isn't tied to WIOA or our other workforce grants. So this is something we've been really looking at in Philly. We've seen some great success so far, and I think it raises a question for us more generally on where are employers in this system? How are they equal partners at the table? And part of that is also how are they equal partners in investment and investing in these outcomes?
Can I build on that?
Yes, please.
And so first of all, Ashley mentioned a book. We have a second volume sponsored by the Federal Reserve Banks of Philadelphia, Chicago,
That's right.
Atlanta, and Richmond, in which these two fabulous women are authors of chapters. And so it talks about a lot of different workforce models and realignment, including around financing. The thing that both of you said that caused me to think about it is in many ways I feel like what we are doing together here and talking about is the idea of trying to bust out of a binary that exists in the system today in certain cases and where it's appropriate, which is that you can invest or there are private student loans in which returns are maximized, but it's a very heavy burden on a lot of people. I mean, Chancellor King talked about people ending up with debt no degree. I mean, that's an all too common outcome for people. And on the other hand, you have scholarships or grants, which are terrific if you can get them, but all the more now, there's just not enough money to go around for everybody. So where are there circumstances where you can operate in that space in the middle and say, in a way that feels fair and reasonable, with design choices that are centered around a knowledge of what are the real barriers that people are facing, tuition or life to participating and persisting and completing these programs and getting good careers? And what does fair repayment mechanisms look like? Maybe it's principal only, maybe it's only when you achieve a certain wage, and thereby, yes, it really isn't an investment. It is going simply to recycle some of those funds and stretch those dollars to serve more people. And that is a design choice that means it won't live for 100 years, not unless you keep funding it. But maybe it's still worth funding, not just because of the people you're supporting, but not just because you're stretching more dollars, but also actually because now I'm getting information about what the outcomes are. Because if you think about the financial system you've created, it's one in which repayment occurs if and only if that person has gotten that job and has gotten that job paying above a certain amount. So you know if they have, but critically you know if they haven't, because they'll tell you, because then they don't have to repay. And that's a really important piece of information to understand which programs and systems are working to help people get the outcomes they need, that can then also help you adjust your funding and where are we focusing this funding versus where should we not be, and be thinking about different sources of funding entirely. So sorry to jump in front of you.
No, that's fine. And I think pulling that together, especially since social finance has played such a critical role in both of these examples, I want to pick up on a point around, so we were talking about outcomes, outputs and outcomes, I think data and metrics. Those of you who know me know I've spent a lot of time over my career looking at metrics, both what are the data we should be collecting and how should we be using it. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how central data are or should be or have been to this work, to pay for success. And then I think based on what all of you know about New York City, what are some of the ingredients that we have in place around data, and what do we not have in place right now in order to really support that work? Sorry for the double-barreled question, but.
I can start. So I think, again, having been inside New York City government and then now inside state government in New Jersey, I started my career in New York as a researcher at Center for Urban Future. It's really interesting to see the path that information takes and how the data, the outcomes, whatever metrics you want to have, need to be adjusted for the relevant audiences. And I think I'm going to kind of combine my answers to your two questions. So I think that too often in the workforce world, we are presenting information and data for how we would want to receive it. Knowing what an ITA voucher is, knowing what we owe a Title II means. The people if the people who could make the decisions were only people who knew what that meant, we would be flush with money. Those aren't the people who are either the barriers or just the prospective converts that need to be persuaded. And I think that the way we built Pay It Forward in New Jersey is essentially we did a call for training providers, asked for an expression of interest. There was, and this, we don't have time to get into the very real kind of contractual parameters, but the state of New Jersey couldn't just hand pick training providers that we wanted to use to have this funding go to. We procured a vendor, Social Finance, and then worked with them. So we had an arm's length for them to be able to do essentially the most exclusive ETPL ever, where instead of the barrier of being on the eligible training provider list being relatively low and simple and accessible, which is not necessarily a bad thing, we set the bar quite a bit higher. We said, who would be interested in being part of this? Got almost 100 training providers of all sorts, public colleges, nonprofits, private training providers, and then said, okay, if you raised your hand and you're interested, here's what you have to do with us. And there was a very extensive due diligence process that Social Finance led on behalf of the state of New Jersey to get much deeper into what kind of how things are operating. There was a level of engagement with staff, there were interviews with students, and there was real rich analysis of data. And that was ultimately the toll booth that providers had to go through. And many of them either gave up halfway through, or the data just didn't show what we needed. Or sometimes the number of students who were achieving the outcomes was just too small for us to be able to extrapolate it. And so I think that we need to do a much better job being able to use this to crystallize information for people who don't know or to some extent don't care how the workforce system should be set up if you can change the message and the angle, I think they will hear it differently. I pledged on our prep call that I would honor my beloved friend and friend of many in this room, Melinda Malaka Mack, who we lost 2 years ago. Melinda was no bullshit. She wouldn't want us to be talking and giving out bullshit. Like, you need to be able to talk to people who don't care about this. And you need to figure out how this applies to things they care about. And so in many ways, I think I sort of said at the beginning in kind of a glib way, like, pay it forward with New Jersey was supposed to be all these things. That's because some of the people who were giving money to it cared about the other things. And we had to find a way to say, in essence, the things you care about, the data show us we either can't do it, or in order to do it, we're gonna have to do these other things. But I think that sometimes we keep presenting information to people and assume that if we just, if we're just even more emphatic, they'll get it. And I think that the piece of it that is so crucial, and this is where Stacey's work over the years and many people in this room have built it up, is the data has to be rock solid. And where you have the biggest gap is around earnings. Because when you look at something that would be, you're essentially taking a speculative risk on, we're gonna pay for someone based on them graduating from this program. Right. That's great. I have spent many years, a decade ago, railing against proprietary schools and predatory training providers because they had amazing graduation rates. Everyone graduates. You can all be video game designers, and then they have huge amounts of debt and no job. So I think that being able to really trust and validate the earnings and the retention after the training provider, then I think that should unlock a level of funding where you give them funding and get out of the way.
I was gonna say, I'll build on that and say, obviously at the Fed, we spend a lot of time in the data. Spend a lot of time in research, and I think what is interesting to us about this outcomes-based funding model is it is reliant on us making sure that the numbers align on the outcomes. And again, I think this is, coming from the work that I did in New York City, it's a challenge to us as systems. Is the system funding an outcome or an output? Are we aligning all of our resources to put people in a program and say, check the box, the program is there? I think we sometimes forget the humanity of the people on the other side of this who get really frustrated, right? And for those of you who have been in the direct service space, which I know many of us on this stage have as well, they're going into programs, finishing sometimes with debt, sometimes with time out of the labor market, getting one credential, getting another credential, and not being able to connect to a job. And so you can imagine how frustrating that is as a learner. And that's why, to me, this is an important conversation, is if we have the ability to realign the funding so we are making sure it gets people to outcomes, we're reducing that feeling that people have of, I'm just the train and pray model. Like, I'm just going through all this training and I'm not actually getting to a place where it's connecting me to a good paying job. And I think Tara hit on it, like, earnings is a really important piece of this. Something I will say about the employer outcomes-based model is the employer also is giving feedback in that model, right? So if I, as the workforce provider, am going to get money when my person hits 6 months or a year, the employer is also going to tell me if that person is having issues on the job or if there are other things that we could do to help that person retain. This is not, did they get any job a year later? This is, did they stay in that job, right? Which is a really different measure of job quality than I got you a seasonal job, I got you 20 hours a week. We're really thinking about how do we connect people to good quality and secure jobs. And I think that's a big shift for the workforce system, to be honest. It's one we've been working on and engaging with for a long time, but the measure shouldn't be, you got a job, any job, congratulations. It really should be about, are we providing people, what we look at a lot is economic stability, right? Most people, when I ask them about economic mobility, they're not interested in, oh, am I going up the ladder? They're actually like really afraid of going down. And we were talking to a lot of people in some research we did last year that said, I just want to know, can I make ends meet? Can I pay bills? And so I know this is a moment in time in New York where we're talking about affordability. And the question is, are we as a workforce system connecting people to the kind of jobs that provide them that stable floor? And how do we stabilize that experience for them by wraparound supports and grants so that they aren't taking a huge risk to take 6 months out of the year to go through a training program? And I think, again, at the end of the day, if we are making these systems more human-centered and more focused on people, we would be thinking about how we're making sure we're getting people the outcomes, because they're investing their time, too, enrolling in our programs and spending that time with us. So I think, to me, those are the numbers we should really be looking at, again, outcomes versus outputs.
If I can just build on both those points. which is to me, what's the data you'd ideally have up front to design these systems? What's the data that you get as a result of implementing these systems? But then importantly, how do you adapt and learn and react to that data, right? So Tara mentioned, in our ideal world, or in anyone's, when you're designing these systems, you have information and you are deciding intentionally based on what you understand of specific programs' outcomes, and specifically kind of wage and career and job longevity outcomes, to say these are the programs we want to support people going through, where we think it's appropriate for them to invest their time, reasonable to expect that they're going to get a good job coming out of it, that will then create some element of financial recyclability into the system. Then you design the system, and sometimes what you think is going to happen is not what happens. And so the beauty of these systems is actually you inherently create that information from the structure. Again, I mentioned it before, if you are asking somebody to pay back if and only if they have a job that's paying above a certain amount, they come to tell you if they are not. And so that information comes back to you. And if you're learning, as we have in some cases, that only 30% of graduates are getting a job paying above $50,000 a year, at some point you say, is this the program that we should be supporting people to go through? And we've had to have that hard conversation where we say, okay, this just isn't getting students the outcomes we want. We need to take this funding and redeploy it somewhere else to a different program that is getting students these outcomes. And so it's that full, yes, due diligence. Practice sometimes doesn't match your diligence, and then how do you learn and adapt from your real lived experience and make change on behalf of the people you're trying to support?
I'm watching the clock. We are going to wrap this on time. I did want to make sure, we have a sizable philanthropic community in New York City that invest in workforce development. And when we think about some of those stakeholders, I haven't heard a lot about the role of philanthropy in pay for success. And so are there natural ways, are there ways that haven't really been leveraged, or that you could think about, what you know about New York City and its philanthropic community around pay for success?
So I'll jump in and say, I think, so first of all, the model we talked about in Philadelphia did also have philanthropic support. When we put together that model, we were able to get what was remaining of, I believe it was SIB funding that was still out there with but we needed philanthropic support to even test and pilot. Now this is something, again, we were really interested in research. A pilot you can look at, and then honestly, we have to be honest sometimes. We had things we learned from this pilot that did not work so well. And we had to say, is this actually functional? And are we going to be honest about the data and say, hey, if we were to improve on this pilot, what are the pieces of this that we could pick up? Now, thankfully, in Philly, the pilot was with the Workforce System, the Workforce Development Board, which is also a nonprofit in Philly, so that works a little bit better. They can make and take funding, which is not the case here in New York City. I do think there is something really powerful to tell funders in this, which is we're at a moment where resources are really constrained. People are worried about workforce dollars. I know this is going to come up a lot today. And as you're trying to think about ways you can either expand the pot, recycle it, Kristen used some great metaphors here. There is something powerful about funders coming in these pay for success models. So the funders who came in and helped create the pay for success model that is now being used by West Philadelphia Skills Initiative, well, now that funding that they initially put in is going to recycle to other learners and other stakeholders. So you may put in a smaller grant that is now going to get more people invested because the employer is paying back the outcome, right? So now the funder is supporting that base pilot, and the nonprofit organization, any of you who work in workforce organizations, I'm sure, are thinking, well, it would be great if they would pay us for the things that we work really hard to do and cost us a lot of money to do. And so I think there's something really powerful there where funders can be engaged in piloting something that has a huge system change effect.
I know we're almost out of time. I would just add that in New Jersey, we also had philanthropic funders, though it was corporate philanthropy through some of the major corporations, Prudential, Merck, Johnson & Johnson, essentially the corporate anchors in New Jersey. What I would put forward as a learning from that process is where we got stuck in some cases in potential expansion of a pay-it-forward model was in programs that are traditionally free. So when you think about some of the programs that philanthropy has funded, often because of incredible data over the years, they're free to learners. And so exploring the notion of having a tandem, parallel classroom where you would have learners, students who were borrowing was sometimes it was almost anathema. And I think that that is something that has to be confronted, because if you ever want to be able to scale some of these privately funded programs, there has to be a discussion of a tolerance of, are you okay having some students who are borrowing in order to be there? And I would sort of put that out, again, on Ashley's point of the resource environment as something I think that should be explored, because you have a potential to really scale there if you can get past some of the roadblocks of just, that's not how we do it.
Final very quick point, which is funders are critical to this work. I mean, they are catalyzing government participation in many, many cases. It was true in New Jersey. It's been true very recently in Massachusetts. There are any number of examples. And the benefits we've talked about are real, which is there's just pure information value about what's working and what's not, let alone the making every dollar do more, right? Every dollar becomes $2, $3, $4 over the course of time in terms of the number of people it can serve, in terms of the information it produces, and in terms of the other dollars then that it brings to the table in increasingly sustainable ways.
All right. Of course, we knew this was going to go by in a flash, but thank you so much for joining us. I hope this conversation sheds a little bit of light on Pay for Success. Maybe you're thinking about it in your own context, and I encourage you to reach out to any of these incredible panelists. Thank you.